Before we dive into today's terrifying tale, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss a spine-chilling story. Let's get into it. Reflections of the Past.
I awoke in a hospital room, the sharp smell of antiseptic cutting through the haze of confusion that enveloped me. Blinking against the harsh fluorescent lights, I tried to piece together how I had ended up here. My body ached, and every movement sent a jolt of pain through me. Panic gripped my chest as I took in my surroundings: sterile white walls, a monitor beeping steadily beside me, and an unsettling silence that wrapped around me like a shroud. I looked around, feeling disoriented. The last thing I remembered was something. A car crash. No, that wasn't right. Fragments of memories flitted just out of reach, like shadows in the corners of my mind. I tried to shake off the feeling, but was drawn to the mirror on the wall opposite my bed. Its surface rippled, almost as if it were alive, distorting my reflection. As I stared into the mirror, I thought I saw something move behind me. Something familiar, someone I thought I had lost. My heart raced, and I leaned closer, straining to catch a glimpse of whatever it was. But just as quickly as it appeared, the figure vanished, leaving me breathless and bewildered. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself, rubbing my eyes. Maybe it was just the medication. As I settled back into the bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The shadows in the corners seemed to deepen, and the air felt thick, almost oppressive. Hours later, when the nurse entered to check on me, I forced a smile, trying to mask my unease. "How long have I been here?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "Just a couple of days," she replied, her smile warm yet distant. "You had a rough time, but you're stable now. Rest is important for your recovery." I nodded but felt a creeping sense of dread. The way she looked at me, was it concern or pity? I couldn't tell. As she adjusted the 4-drip, I caught a glimpse of my reflection again, and this time it seemed different. A flicker of movement danced across the surface, a fleeting image of a younger me, laughing, carefree. But the moment I focused on it, the image warped, twisting into something horrific. My face, contorted in pain, shadows swirling around me. I gasped and turned away, my heart pounding. "What's wrong with the mirror?" I asked, my voice shaking. "It's just an old hospital," the nurse said, her tone dismissive. "They can be a bit warped, you know." I forced a smile, but the unease settled deeper in my gut. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I felt the pull of the mirror. It was almost as if it were calling to me, beckoning me to look closer. But I knew better. Whatever lurked within that glass, I wasn't ready to face it yet. As sleep slowly began to claim me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something malevolent was waiting just beyond my sight, hiding within the shadows and reflections of my past. The following days dragged on like a fog, each one blending into the next. My recovery felt slow, and the isolation of my hospital room weighed heavily on me. I often found myself glancing at the mirror, half expecting to see something shift in its depths. Each time, I was met with the same distorted reflection, warped and twisted as if mocking me. It was during one particularly restless night, with the hospital silent except for the distant sounds of beeping machines, that the mirror finally captured my attention. The surface shimmered, and I found myself drawn to it, unable to resist the urge to look closer. As I leaned in, the world around me faded, and suddenly, I was no longer in my room. I was standing in a sunlit backyard, surrounded by laughter and joy. I recognized it instantly. My childhood birthday party. Friends were running around, and I could see my younger self, a bright-eyed girl with a huge smile, blowing out candles on a colorful cake. My heart swelled with nostalgia. I hadn't thought about that day in years. But then, without warning, the scene shifted. The laughter faded into screams, and the cake splattered with blood. I stumbled back, horrified as the party turned into a nightmare. The children's faces twisted in fear, their screams echoing in my ears as I watched the scene unravel. My heart raced as I fought to look away, but the mirror held me captive. "Help!" I heard a voice call out, faint yet familiar. My mother. The thought sent chills down my spine. "Help me, please." I shot upright in my bed, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. The room felt colder, the shadows more pronounced. I turned to the mirror, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw her face, pale, with hollow eyes, reaching out toward me. But just like before, it vanished, leaving me trembling. The days continued, and the visions grew more vivid. I could see flashes of my past, moments of happiness intertwined with deep sorrow. I'd catch glimpses of my father's disappointed face during my teenage years, the argument we'd had just before he passed away. Each memory brought a fresh wave of guilt and pain, and I felt like I was drowning in a sea of regrets. Desperate for clarity, I sought the therapist I had seen during my stay. In our sessions, I hesitantly recounted my experiences, trying to untangle the mess of emotions that swirled inside me. "You need to confront these memories," she advised gently. "They're holding you back." That night, as I lay in bed, I steeled myself. I knew I had to return to the mirror, to face whatever dark entity was lurking there. I had to reclaim my past instead of allowing it to consume me. Taking a deep breath, I stood before the mirror once more, my reflection wavering slightly in the dim light. "What do you want from me?" I demanded, my voice trembling but resolute. The surface rippled, and a chorus of voices erupted, drowning me in their pain. "You abandoned us. You must pay." I clenched my fists, determination surging within me. "No, I won't let you take me," I shouted, feeling the room vibrate with the force of my defiance. But the shadows seemed to close in, suffocating me. I had to face this darkness, to confront the past that haunted me. I couldn't run anymore. I needed to find a way to break free from these reflections that threatened to pull me into a reality I couldn't escape. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister was lurking just beyond the veil of my memories. As I lay in bed, the shadows in my room stretched and warped, creeping closer as if they had a life of their own. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the soothing sounds of the hospital, the soft hum of machinery, the distant footsteps of nurses. But the darkness tugged at me, an invisible thread pulling me deeper into a nightmare. After another restless day filled with visions of my past, I decided to take a midnight stroll through the hospital's empty corridors. Perhaps the movement would clear my mind, or maybe I was simply searching for a way to escape the oppressive weight of my room. As I stepped out into the hall, the cool air washed over me, a welcome relief from the stifling confines of my room. The flickering fluorescent lights cast eerie shadows, and the silence was almost deafening. Each step echoed in the stillness, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, waiting behind me. I walked past rooms filled with sleeping patients, their faces illuminated by the pale light, but something was off. The stillness felt too quiet, too calm, as if the hospital itself was holding its breath. As I passed the nurses' station, I noticed the staff members huddled together, whispering with furrowed brows. They glanced up at me, their eyes wide with concern, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "Is everything okay?" I asked, my voice shaky. One of the nurses exchanged a look with her colleague before turning to me. "Just keep your head down, okay? It's a long night," she replied, her tone laced with unease. I nodded, confusion swirling in my mind. Why did they seem so on edge? Shaking off my discomfort, I continued down the corridor, drawn to the small waiting area with its worn-out chairs and flickering TV. The mirror there caught my eye, its surface reflecting not just my image but also the shadows that danced behind me. Suddenly, I felt a cold breeze sweep through the room, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I turned sharply, but the corridor was empty. My heart raced as I stepped closer to the mirror, unable to resist the magnetic pull it had on me. As I peered into it, the reflection twisted and contorted, morphing into a chaotic scene of anguish. I saw my mother again, but this time she was standing in a darkened room, her face streaked with tears. "Help me," she whispered, her voice echoing like a distant memory. I could feel her pain seep into my bones, pulling me deeper into the mirror's depths. "No," I cried, stepping back, but the mirror warped, the shadows expanding as if hungry to consume me. The whispers surrounded me, urging me to stay, to surrender to the darkness. "Join us," they coaxed, each voice a painful reminder of my past mistakes. Panic surged through me as I realized I was losing control. The memories rushed back, overwhelming me. My failures, my regrets, the people I had let down. I could feel the darkness closing in, its icy grip tightening around my heart. I had to escape. Turning away from the mirror, I sprinted down the corridor, my footsteps pounding against the cold tile. I could hear the echoes of laughter and cries behind me, a cacophony of voices beckoning me to return. "Stay with us, forever," they pleaded. As I reached the end of the hall, I collided with a door, flinging it open and bursting into the sterile break room. I leaned against the cool metal countertop, gasping for breath. The fluorescent lights flickered above me, casting erratic shadows across the room. I closed my eyes, willing the memories to fade, but they clawed at me, relentless. I couldn't escape. I had to find a way to confront the darkness, to reclaim my past before it consumed me completely. I barely slept that night, the echoes of my memories reverberating in my mind like a haunting melody. I knew that avoiding the mirror wasn't enough. I had to confront whatever malevolent force resided within its depths. But how? I felt like a moth drawn to a flame, caught between the desire to flee and the undeniable pull of the darkness. The following day, I gathered what little strength I had left and approached the therapist once again. I had to tell her everything, every vision, every chilling encounter with the mirror. Sitting across from her, I could see the concern etched on her face, but I also noticed something else, a flicker of intrigue. "I need to confront my past," I declared, my voice firm. "I can't keep running away from it." She nodded slowly, her brow furrowed. Sometimes, facing our fears requires more than just willingness. It requires preparation. Are you ready to dive deeper into your memories? "Yes," I replied, a surge of determination flooding through me. "I need to understand what's happening, even if it terrifies me." After our session, I returned to my room and prepared myself mentally for the confrontation ahead. As night fell, the hospital transformed into a labyrinth of shadows, each corner whispering secrets I couldn't comprehend. The mirror in my room loomed like a sentry, waiting patiently for me to return. When I stood before it, I felt a strange mix of dread and resolve. The air thickened, the shadows deepened, and I knew this was it. I took a deep breath and locked my gaze on my reflection. "I'm not afraid of you," I declared, my voice steadier than I felt. The mirror shimmered, and the room around me began to shift. I was no longer in my hospital room, but standing in the backyard from my childhood memories. The sky was painted with hues of orange and pink, the scent of summer in the air. But as I looked closer, the colors darkened, twisting into ominous shades. "Help me!" The voice was faint but unmistakable. My mother's cry echoed through the fading light. I felt a surge of panic. "Where are you?" I called out, my heart racing. The scene shifted again, plunging me into darkness, the laughter of children now replaced by haunting cries. Shadows loomed, stretching toward me like claws eager to drag me down. "Face it!" I shouted, the words escaping my lips in a desperate plea. "I won't let you take me." With a rush, the memories collided around me, each one a tormenting reminder of the past. I saw the moment I had lost my mother, her fragile figure crumpling to the floor, the frantic calls for help, the icy fingers of grief wrapping around my heart. "I'm so sorry," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I never meant to abandon you." In that moment of vulnerability, the shadows surged, engulfing me. But instead of fear, I felt a strange sense of clarity. I realized the darkness was not just a malevolent force, it was my own sorrow, my own guilt. I had allowed it to fester, to twist my memories into something monstrous. "I forgive you," I said, my voice stronger now. "And I forgive myself." As those words escaped me, the shadows began to dissipate, retreating like mist before the dawn. The backyard brightened, the laughter returning, echoing around me. I could feel the warmth of my mother's presence, a gentle touch on my shoulder. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice wrapping around me like a comforting embrace. The mirror shimmered once more, and I was pulled back into my hospital room, breathless but liberated. The reflection before me was no longer twisted or distorted. I could see myself clearly, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt free. But I knew the battle wasn't over. The darkness might retreat, but it would always be a part of me. I had to remain vigilant, ready to confront it whenever it threatened to resurface. As I lay in bed, the shadows felt lighter, the oppressive weight lifting slightly. I realized that healing was not about forgetting my past, but about accepting it and finding peace within. The sun rose the next morning, casting warm rays of light through the window, flooding my hospital room with a golden glow. I blinked against the brightness, feeling a strange mix of hope and anxiety swirling inside me. The events of the previous night felt surreal, almost like a dream, but the clarity I had gained was undeniable. I was still here, still breathing, and somehow I felt lighter. As I sat up in bed, I glanced at the mirror across the room. No longer did it seem like a portal to darkness. Instead, it felt like a reflection of my journey, a reminder of the battles I had fought within myself. The memories that once haunted me were still there, but now they didn't control me. I could face them, and that knowledge alone was empowering. I spent the day focusing on my recovery, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to share my experience with others. Maybe there were others in the hospital struggling with their own shadows, needing to hear that they weren't alone. I decided to talk to my therapist about holding a small group session for patients, an opportunity for us to connect, to share our stories and perhaps help each other heal. When I approached her later that day, I was met with a warm smile. "That's a wonderful idea," she said, her eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. "Creating a space for open dialogue can be incredibly therapeutic." I spent the next few days preparing for the session. I felt nervous but also excited. I wanted to create a safe space where people could confront their fears without judgment. I wanted them to know that it was okay to share their pain and that together we could face the darkness. Finally, the day arrived. I sat in a small circle with a few other patients, their faces reflecting a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. I introduced myself and began to share my story, the fear I had felt, and the lessons I had learned. As I spoke, I could see a shift in the room, a growing sense of camaraderie and understanding. One by one, others began to share their experiences, revealing their own struggles with memories and trauma. As the stories unfolded, I felt the atmosphere change. We were no longer just individuals facing our own demons. We were a community, supporting each other through the darkness. Laughter broke through the tears, and slowly, the weight that had burdened each of us began to lift. I realized that sharing our stories had the power to transform fear into strength. After the session, I felt rejuvenated, filled with a sense of purpose. I had faced my past and emerged stronger, and now I was helping others do the same. The shadows still lingered, but they no longer felt overwhelming. They were simply reminders of the battles I had fought and won. As the weeks passed, I continued to hold these sessions, watching as others found their voices and began to heal. I no longer feared the mirror in my room. Instead, I used it as a tool for reflection, a way to remind myself of the strength I had discovered within. I knew that healing was not linear. It would ebb and flow like the tide, but I felt prepared to face whatever came next. I had transformed my pain into purpose, and for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful about the future. One evening, as I prepared for bed, I stood before the mirror and smiled at my reflection. "You're not alone," I whispered, the words feeling like a promise. I turned off the light and climbed into bed, ready to embrace whatever dreams awaited me, confident that I would face them head-on. The shadows may linger, but so too does the light, and I had finally learned to walk in both.
The death of the intern.
I remember the night we arrived at St. Augustine Hospital like it was yesterday. The air was thick with an unsettling chill, even for October. The hospital loomed over us, an old, crumbling structure nestled on the outskirts of our town. Its broken windows and peeling paint seemed to whisper tales of tragedy and despair, and I could feel an ominous weight pressing down on my chest as I approached the entrance. Our supervisor, Dr. Harris, greeted us with an unsettling grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Welcome to your first night as interns. Tonight, you'll experience the real world of medicine. Its fears, its surprises, and perhaps a little history." As we stepped inside, the heavy doors creaked ominously, echoing through the empty hallway. The fluorescent lights flickered above us, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. I glanced at my fellow interns, each one wearing a mask of bravado, but I could see the flicker of fear in their eyes. Dr. Harris split us into pairs for the night, and I was assigned to work with Sarah, my best friend and fellow intern. We set up our base at the old nurses' station, which felt more like a mausoleum than a workspace. The atmosphere grew heavier with each passing minute, and I could feel a creeping sense of dread building inside me. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we tried to shake off our unease with jokes and laughter. But there was an undercurrent of tension, a gnawing awareness that something wasn't right. I glanced around, catching snippets of conversation from other groups, some sharing whispers about the hospital's haunted past and the rumors surrounding it. "Did you know an intern died here?" Sarah said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "They say his ghost still roams these halls." I could see the fear in her eyes, and it mirrored my own. Just as I began to dismiss her words, the lights flickered again, and a chill ran down my spine. I felt as if the hospital itself was alive, watching us with a sinister gaze. I shook off the feeling, convincing myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew this night would change everything. As we settled in for the long hours ahead, a sense of foreboding hung in the air, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Little did I know, the horrors that awaited us were far beyond anything I could have imagined. As the clock struck midnight, the atmosphere in the hospital shifted. The initial thrill of being in such an old, haunted building began to morph into something far more sinister. Strange noises echoed through the corridors, soft whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, distant cries that made my skin crawl, and footsteps that echoed when no one was around. I tried to brush it off as the old building settling, but an uncomfortable knot formed in my stomach. Sarah and I exchanged nervous glances, our earlier bravado waning as the reality of our surroundings began to sink in. Determined to shake off the fear, we decided to explore the lower floors. "Let's see if we can find something interesting," I suggested, trying to sound more confident than I felt. We crept down the dimly lit hallway, the cold air wrapping around us like a shroud. Our footsteps echoed ominously as we ventured deeper into the hospital, the flickering fluorescent lights above casting erratic shadows that danced across the walls. I couldn't help but feel like we were intruding on something we didn't fully understand. As we turned a corner, we stumbled upon a room marked Records. My heart raced with curiosity, and I pushed the door open, revealing a dusty room filled with old patient files. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and neglect, and as I stepped inside, the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. "Look at this," I said, flipping through the brittle papers. Among the files, I found one labeled Ethan Miller. I held it up for Sarah to see. "This is the intern who died here." She stepped closer, peering over my shoulder. "What happened to him?" I skimmed the details. Ethan had died during a routine procedure, but the file hinted at something darker, whispers of negligence and mismanagement. He was supposed to save a patient, but ended up losing his life instead. "They say he haunts this place, searching for answers." As we continued to sift through the documents, I felt a chill creep down my spine. "Do you think his spirit is still here?" I asked, glancing at Sarah, who was now visibly shaken. Before she could respond, a loud bang echoed from the far end of the corridor, startling us both. "What was that?" I exclaimed, my heart racing. The playful spirit of the night had evaporated, replaced by a raw sense of fear. "Let's check it out," I suggested, my voice barely masking my anxiety. We crept toward the sound, the air growing colder with every step. The walls felt like they were closing in around us, and I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. As we approached the door from which the noise had come, I noticed something peculiar. It was slightly ajar, inviting us into the darkness beyond. "Should we?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear. But before I could respond, the door swung open completely, as if urging us to step inside. The room was dark, the shadows heavy and oppressive. I felt a rush of adrenaline and dread as I crossed the threshold, unwilling to turn back now. And that's when I heard it, a soft sobbing sound, coming from somewhere deep within the room. The moment I stepped into the room, the air felt thick, almost suffocating. My heart raced as I strained to listen to the sobbing, a sound so raw and sorrowful that it sent chills down my spine. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Sarah, my voice trembling. She nodded, her eyes wide with fear as we exchanged glances, both too terrified to speak. "Maybe it's just the wind," I suggested, but even I didn't believe my own words. I stepped further into the room, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. Shadows twisted in the corners, playing tricks on my mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. As I moved deeper, I spotted a figure hunched over in the corner, shrouded in darkness. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, unable to move. "Ethan," I whispered, the name spilling from my lips like a prayer. The sobbing grew quieter, and the figure slowly turned its head toward me. My heart raced as I caught a glimpse of a young man, his scrubs tattered and stained, his eyes hollow and filled with anguish. "Help me," he murmured, his voice a ghostly echo in the silence. I felt a wave of compassion wash over me, but fear held me in place. "What happened to you?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The room felt colder, as if the very air around us was mourning his tragic fate. "I didn't mean to die. I was trying to save them," Ethan said, his words heavy with despair. A part of me wanted to reach out to him, to comfort him, but I could feel a barrier between us, an invisible wall forged by pain and loss. Before I could respond, Sarah grabbed my arm, her grip tight. "We need to go," she urged, her voice shaky. But I couldn't tear my gaze away from Ethan. I felt drawn to him, as if he were a thread connecting me to a past I could barely comprehend. "Wait," I called out, my heart aching. "What do you need from us?" He pointed toward a rusty cabinet across the room. "Find it, the truth." The moment he spoke, the atmosphere shifted, and a dark energy enveloped us. The shadows deepened, swirling around like a storm. I felt disoriented, as if the room itself was trying to push me away. "What truth?" I shouted, panic rising in my chest. "Please," he implored, his voice breaking. "You have to know what happened." Just then, the lights above us flickered violently, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I wanted to help him, but fear gripped me like a vice. The shadows in the corners twisted and contorted, and I could sense the anguish emanating from Ethan, a sorrow that reverberated through the very foundation of the hospital. "Let's get out of here," Sarah pleaded, pulling me back toward the door. But I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, compelled by Ethan's desperate need for closure. I looked into his eyes, feeling the weight of his tragedy, and in that moment, I realized that we had to uncover his story, not just for him, but for every soul lost within these walls. As I finally broke free from his gaze and turned to leave, I felt an icy grip on my heart. "We'll help you," I shouted, the words spilling out in a rush. But as we stumbled back toward the door, I could hear Ethan's sobs echoing in the distance, a haunting reminder of the unresolved pain that lingered in the shadows of St. Augustine Hospital. We burst through the door and into the dimly lit corridor, panting heavily as adrenaline coursed through our veins. My heart felt like it was going to explode. "What just happened?" Sarah gasped, looking back at the room we'd just fled. "Did you see him? That wasn't just some prank. He was real." "I know," I replied, struggling to process what we'd just experienced. "Ethan, he was asking for our help. We need to figure out what happened to him." But even as I said it, doubt crept in. Was I really ready to delve deeper into this darkness? We returned to the nurse's station, our base for the night, and I rummaged through the papers we had found earlier. My hands trembled as I searched for any hint or clue about Ethan's past. "There has to be something here," I murmured, flipping through the files and desperately scanning for his name again. Sarah paced back and forth, her anxiety palpable. "Do you really think we should be digging into this? What if we're not supposed to know? What if we wake something up?" I paused, my heart sinking at her words. But what if we don't? What if he's trapped here because no one knows what happened to him? He needs us. After what felt like an eternity, I finally found it, a brittle old newspaper clipping wedged between two faded patient files. The headline read, "Intern dies during routine procedure, questions raised about negligence." My stomach twisted as I read the details. Ethan had been a promising young intern who had made a critical mistake during an emergency surgery, and a patient had died as a result. The report mentioned that he was found alone, distraught and blaming himself for the tragedy. "See," I said, turning the article toward Sarah. "He didn't just die. He was haunted by what happened. He felt responsible for the patient's death." "But how does that explain what we just saw?" she replied, her voice rising in frustration. "We can't just assume he's something supernatural now because we saw a ghost. There has to be a logical explanation." Before I could respond, a loud crash echoed down the hallway, and we both jumped. The lights flickered violently, and I could feel a thick, oppressive energy building around us. "We should check it out," I said, feeling a sense of urgency rising within me. "If Ethan is trying to communicate, we can't ignore it." As we cautiously made our way down the corridor, the air grew colder, and I could hear my own breath quickening with each step. I followed the sound of the commotion, the unsettling noises leading us toward the old surgical wing of the hospital. When we reached the double doors, I hesitated. A strange feeling washed over me, a mix of fear and determination. "We have to go in," I insisted, pushing the door open. Inside, the room was dark, the shadows deep and unnerving. An array of surgical tools lay scattered across the floor, gleaming ominously under the flickering fluorescent lights. In the center of the room, an operating table sat shrouded in darkness, a stark reminder of the horrors that once took place there. I felt a chill creep up my spine as I stepped inside, the door creaking ominously behind us. "What if this is a mistake?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. But I knew we had to confront whatever was happening. We couldn't leave Ethan in torment. Suddenly, the temperature dropped even further, and I felt a presence looming in the room. "Ethan," I called out, my voice shaky but firm. "If you're here, we want to help you. Just show us what we need to do." The lights flickered wildly, and I could see a figure emerging from the shadows, his outline indistinct but familiar. "Help me," he breathed, and my heart sank at the anguish etched in his voice. But this time, I felt something shift in the air, an energy so potent it almost knocked the wind out of me. "What do you want us to do?" I shouted, desperate for answers. The figure pointed toward the operating table, and I could feel dread pooling in my stomach as the realization hit me. We needed to confront the truth of that night, the horror of what had happened. The truth wasn't just about Ethan. It was about the dark history of the hospital itself, a truth that had to be unearthed, no matter the cost. My heart raced as I stepped closer to the operating table, the figure of Ethan hovering just beyond my reach. Shadows twisted around him, whispering secrets I couldn't understand. "What do you want us to do?" I asked again, desperation lacing my voice. Ethan's sorrowful gaze bore into me, and I felt a deep sense of urgency. "You must find the truth. Only then can I be free," he said, his voice echoing eerily in the room. I glanced at Sarah, who stood frozen in place, fear evident in her eyes. "We can do this," I assured her, my voice trembling but resolute. "We have to confront whatever happened that night." With a nod, we both stepped toward the operating table, where a dusty surgical tray lay scattered with old tools, remnants of procedures long forgotten. "What do we look for?" Sarah whispered, her voice quaking. Before I could answer, the lights flickered violently again, and the air felt charged with electricity. Suddenly, a flash of memory flooded my mind, a vision of that fateful night when Ethan had lost his patient. I could see him standing at the operating table, panic etched across his face, as the doctors around him shouted orders. The memory felt so real, so vivid. "Ethan!" I called out, tears stinging my eyes as I absorbed the weight of his tragedy. "You were trying to save them. You didn't fail." A gust of wind swept through the room, and the temperature plummeted. The walls seemed to close in, and I felt an overwhelming sense of grief enveloping me. The tools on the table rattled violently, and the shadows danced menacingly. "You need to tell us what happened," I shouted, desperation tinging my voice. The figure of Ethan seemed to shimmer, as if he were flickering between two worlds. "Find the records," he urged, his voice barely above a whisper. "They hide the truth about the patient." In that moment, I understood. There had to be more in the hospital's archives, something that could shed light on the events of that tragic night. "We need to go back to the records room," I exclaimed, feeling a surge of determination. We sprinted back through the corridors, the echoes of our footsteps mingling with the disembodied whispers that seemed to follow us. When we reached the records room, I flung the door open and began rifling through the files, my heart pounding in my chest. "Here!" I shouted, pulling out a file marked with the same patient's name from the newspaper article. "This has to be it." As I opened the file, I discovered a series of notes from Ethan's supervisors detailing the chaos that had unfolded during the surgery. They spoke of cut corners, of a lack of preparation, and a series of unfortunate events that led to the tragedy. But there was something else, a notation about how the hospital had swept the incident under the rug, silencing those who dared to speak out. "This is it," I whispered, feeling a sense of empowerment as I shared the information with Sarah. Ethan was right. They covered up the truth. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, and I could feel the temperature drop even further. The shadows swirled around us, thick and suffocating. "Ethan!" I called out, my heart racing. "We found it! We know the truth!" In that moment, the room filled with a blinding light, illuminating the darkness that had surrounded us. I felt Ethan's presence growing stronger, an overwhelming wave of relief washing over him. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice now filled with a profound sense of peace. The shadows began to recede, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. I could feel a warmth enveloping the room as if the very essence of the hospital was transforming. "You're free now," I said, tears streaming down my face. As the light faded, Ethan's figure began to dissolve, but his grateful smile remained etched in my mind. "Tell my story," he urged, and with that he was gone. The silence that followed was deafening, but in that stillness, I felt a sense of closure. The hospital felt different now, lighter, almost liberated from the burden of its dark past. As we stepped back into the hallway, I turned to Sarah, my heart still racing. "We have to tell everyone what we found. This hospital needs to be held accountable." "Yeah," she replied, her voice steadier now. "We owe it to him." With a new sense of purpose, we left the shadows of St. Augustine Hospital behind us, determined to share Ethan's story and to ensure that no one else would suffer in silence. As we stepped into the cool night air, I realized that the darkness could never truly hold us captive, as long as we had the courage to confront it and to speak the truth.
The Nursing Whisper.
As I stood in the dimly lit corridor of St. Mary's Hospital, the familiar weight of unease settled on my chest. After 15 years of working night shifts, I had grown accustomed to the sounds that filled the air, the rhythmic beeping of machines, the distant echoes of footsteps, and the low murmur of conversations drifting through the sterile halls. But tonight felt different. There was an undercurrent of tension that I couldn't quite shake. I noticed the new nurses, a trio of fresh faces, gathered near the nurses' station, their heads bent close together. They whispered in hushed tones, their eyes darting around as if they were afraid of being overheard. A shiver ran down my spine when their laughter erupted, sharp and unsettling, echoing through the empty corridor. It was a sound that made my skin crawl, as if they were sharing a secret joke at my expense. As I continued my rounds, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of paranoia. Their glances seemed to linger on me, their whispers turning into snickers the moment I passed by. It wasn't just me. The patients, too, seemed to be aware of their odd behavior. I overheard one elderly man mumble to himself about the watchers as I delivered his medication. I brushed it off as confusion from his medication, but deep down, an unsettling knot formed in my stomach. By the time my shift neared its end, I found myself checking the clock more often than usual. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. As I walked past the break room, I caught a glimpse of the trio again, leaning closer together, their heads almost touching. They turned to me as I entered, their laughter dying down, replaced by an eerie silence. I forced a smile, trying to shake off the feeling that I was being scrutinized like some sort of specimen. As I made my way back to the nurses' station, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see them following me. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting strange shadows along the walls. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thoughts racing through my mind. Surely, I was just overreacting after a long night. But as I settled into my final tasks of the shift, the whispering continued to echo in my mind, a haunting reminder that something was very, very wrong. I just couldn't put my finger on what it was, and that uncertainty gnawed at me like a hungry animal. Little did I know, this was only the beginning of a nightmare I had yet to fully comprehend. The following shifts felt like an unending cycle of dread. As I walked through the sterile hallways of St. Mary's, I kept an eye on the trio of new nurses. Their names were Laura, Jenna, and Mark, but to me, they were simply the whispering shadows that haunted my nights. Every time I passed them, I could feel their eyes on me, a cold gaze that seemed to pierce right through my carefully maintained facade of calm. At first, I tried to dismiss their behavior as typical of young nurses eager to bond, but the way they huddled together, exchanging furtive glances, sent chills down my spine. Their laughter, which had initially struck me as innocuous, now sounded twisted, filled with an edge of something sinister. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were sharing secrets, secrets meant to be kept from me. One evening, I was preparing to administer medication to a patient in room 214, Mrs. Jenkins, when I overheard Laura and Jenna whispering just outside the door. I paused, pretending to check the patient's chart while straining to hear their conversation. "The collection is almost complete," I heard Jenna say, her voice barely above a whisper. I felt a jolt of panic shoot through me, a visceral response that urged me to leave the room. I chalked it up to the exhaustion and stress of the job, but my gut twisted in protest. What were they talking about? My heart raced as I resumed my duties, but I couldn't shake the thought that something dark was lurking beneath the surface. As I continued my rounds, I noticed how the patients were reacting to the new nurses. More than once, I caught an elderly man mumbling about the watchers, his gaze fixed on the trio with a mixture of fear and desperation. It made my skin crawl. Were they truly behaving that strangely, or was my mind simply spiraling into paranoia? During my breaks, I confided in a few of my colleagues, but they brushed off my concerns. You know how it is with new nurses, Anna. They're just trying to fit in, one of them laughed, but I didn't find it funny. Something was undeniably off, and I felt the weight of that truth pressing down on me. That night, as I left the break room, I spotted the trio again. They were standing in a circle, whispering and giggling like school children. As I walked past, Laura glanced at me and smiled, a wide, almost predatory grin that sent a jolt of fear through my veins. I turned my head quickly, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling growing inside me. The following days were a blur of unsettling encounters and nervous glances. I began to dread the night shifts, where every shadow felt like a threat and every whispered word echoed with malevolence. I found myself jumping at the slightest noise, my heart racing with an instinctual fear that refused to be silenced. One night, after finishing a round, I returned to the nurses' station and caught sight of a flickering light coming from the supply room. Curious and slightly apprehensive, I crept closer, peering inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. Laura, Jenna, and Mark were gathered around a small, dimly lit candle, their faces illuminated in a ghostly glow. They seemed to be engrossed in something on the floor, and as I strained to hear, I could make out their hushed voices. "They will be ours soon," Laura murmured, her voice filled with an eerie reverence. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to know what they were doing, but fear held me frozen in place. Just then, I felt a presence behind me, a cold breath against my neck that sent my heart racing. I turned, but there was nothing there, only the oppressive darkness of the hallway and the distant sounds of the hospital, echoing like a cruel reminder that I was far from safe. My heart raced as I stumbled back from the supply room, the chilling words of Laura echoing in my mind. "They will be ours soon." What did that even mean? I felt a surge of determination mixed with dread. I had to find out what was happening. The hospital was my second home, and I couldn't let it become a place of darkness and fear. The next day, I decided to do some digging. I started with the personnel files, looking for any background information on Laura, Jenna, and Mark. They had been hired just a few months ago, and while their resumes looked impeccable, something felt off. I made a mental note to check the hospital's archives for any past incidents related to them. As I sifted through the paperwork in the storage room, a sense of foreboding washed over me. The files were disorganized, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Just as I was about to give up, I found a small folder marked Incident Reports. My hands trembled as I opened it, the pages yellowed and worn. The reports were vague, mentioning unexplained incidents and odd behavior from some of the staff, but one caught my attention: a string of mysterious patient deaths that had occurred shortly before Laura, Jenna, and Mark were hired. The report hinted at something sinister, but it was heavily redacted. I could barely make out phrases like suspicious circumstances and unusual rituals. My stomach churned as I realized I had stumbled onto something dark. Later that night, I decided to confront one of the older nurses, Sarah, who had been working at St. Mary's long before I arrived. I found her in the break room, sipping her usual cup of coffee. As I sat down across from her, I hesitated before speaking. "Sarah, can I ask you something?" She looked up, her brow furrowing. "Sure. Anna, what's on your mind?" "I've noticed some strange behavior from the new nurses, Laura, Jenna, and Mark. Have you heard anything about them? Anything unusual?" Her expression shifted, a shadow passing over her face. "You shouldn't concern yourself with them. Just focus on your patients." That answer did nothing to ease my fears. But there have been reports about the patients, I pressed. Sarah sighed, her gaze dropping to her coffee cup. Listen, Anna, I've seen things in this hospital that would make your skin crawl. Some of those nurses have a different perspective on life and death. Just be careful. Her cryptic warning only fueled my anxiety. What could she possibly mean? I felt like I was racing against time, and the thought of a patient suffering because of these nurses drove me forward. I resolved to keep a closer watch on them. The following night, I took it upon myself to monitor their shifts, observing their interactions with the patients. I noticed them spending excessive time in rooms with terminally ill patients, their whispered conversations blending into the background noise of beeping machines and distant murmurs. They appeared almost affectionate, which only deepened my unease. That night, Mrs. Jenkins, the elderly patient who had whispered to me before, suddenly called out for me. I rushed to her side, heart pounding. "What is it, Mrs. Jenkins?" Her eyes widened with fear, and she gripped my hand tightly. "They're here to take me," she gasped, her voice trembling. "You have to stop them. They're not what they seem." I tried to calm her down, but her panic was infectious. "You're safe with me. Just breathe, okay?" But deep down, I felt the same fear she did. I needed to protect her, and I knew I had to confront the new nurses. After my shift, I returned to the supply room where I had seen them before. My heart raced as I crept inside, determined to uncover their secret. As I searched the dimly lit space, I found a small leather-bound book tucked away on a shelf. Its cover was embossed with strange symbols, and I hesitated before opening it. What I found inside made my blood run cold: rituals, incantations, and references to collecting souls. This was no ordinary nursing manual. It was a record of a twisted belief system, one that treated life and death as a game. I realized then that I was standing on the precipice of something far darker than I could have imagined. As I flipped through the pages, a noise behind me made me freeze. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my ears, and saw Laura standing in the doorway, her expression twisted into a disturbing smile. "Looking for something, Anna?" she asked, her voice dripping with mockery. The shadows around her seemed to stretch and pulse, closing in on me as I realized I had walked into their trap. Panic surged through me as Laura stepped closer, her predatory smile growing wider with each passing second. "What are you doing here?" I stammered, trying to keep my voice steady. But deep down, I knew I was cornered. The leather-bound book slipped from my trembling hands and fell to the floor, pages fluttering open like a wounded bird. Laura's gaze flicked to the book, her eyes narrowing. "You shouldn't have been poking around in things that don't concern you." Her tone was eerily calm, as if she was discussing a mundane task rather than a sinister reality. I forced myself to take a step back, my mind racing for a way out. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What's going on with you and the others? You're not acting like nurses." She let out a low, mocking laugh that echoed through the dark supply room. "Oh, Anna, you're so naive. We're not here to save lives. We're here to collect." The word lingered in the air, thick with malevolence. Before I could respond, the door creaked open behind me, and Jenna stepped in, her expression equally unsettling. "Looks like we have a little visitor," she said, a gleam of excitement in her eyes. "Isn't she adorable when she's confused?" I backed away further, pressing against the shelves stacked with medical supplies. "You're insane. You can't be serious about this," I shouted, desperation clawing at my throat. Mark joined them, leaning casually against the doorframe with an unsettling smirk. "Oh, but we are," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. "You've seen the way we care for our patients. We offer them freedom, a release from their suffering. They become part of something greater." I shook my head in disbelief. "You're taking lives. This isn't right." Laura stepped closer, invading my personal space. "You think we're the monsters here? You have no idea what lies beyond. The patients, Anna, they're just waiting for someone to help them move on. We just facilitate the process." Suddenly, the air felt thick with tension. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, a frantic drumbeat warning me that I needed to escape. "I'm going to tell someone," I shouted defiantly, but deep down, I feared it would be useless. Who would believe me? "Go ahead," Jenna taunted, crossing her arms. "But you'll find that the truth is easily buried in a place like this. People like us always get what we want." In that moment, the realization hit me like a cold wave. They had already infiltrated the system. They could easily make me disappear if I posed a threat. I had to find a way out. I turned, my heart racing as I dashed toward the exit, but Laura was quicker. She lunged for my arm, her grip like iron. "Where do you think you're going?" she hissed, her eyes darkening with malice. In that instant, I felt a surge of adrenaline. I twisted out of her grasp and sprinted past her, fueled by fear and desperation. I bolted down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the empty space, the fluorescent lights overhead flickering ominously. I dashed into the nearest patient room and locked the door behind me, pressing my back against it as I caught my breath. My mind raced. What could I do? How could I stop them? I couldn't just stand by and let this continue. Suddenly, I heard muffled voices outside the door, their laughter sending shivers down my spine. They were toying with me, waiting for me to make a move. I glanced around the room, my eyes landing on the window. It was my only chance. I hurried to the window, the cool night air spilling into the room as I fumbled to open it. I could hear their footsteps drawing closer, their taunts echoing in the corridor. "You can't hide forever, Anna," Mark called out, his voice dripping with mockery. I climbed out of the window, the ground below seeming much farther than I had anticipated. My heart raced as I landed awkwardly on the grass, pain shooting through my ankle. I pushed through it, forcing myself to run toward the parking lot, where the shadows loomed like specters in the night. As I sprinted, I could hear their laughter trailing behind me, a chilling reminder that they were still hunting me. "You can't escape the truth," Jenna's voice echoed in the darkness. Fear and adrenaline surged through my veins as I reached my car. I fumbled with my keys, glancing over my shoulder. The trio emerged from the shadows, their faces illuminated by the harsh lights of the hospital, a twisted mockery of smiles plastered on their faces. I finally managed to unlock the door and jumped inside, slamming it shut. My hands shook as I started the engine, but my heart sank when I realized I had only bought myself a moment. The car's headlights illuminated the area, revealing the three of them standing just outside, their figures eerily calm as they watched me with predatory eyes. As I backed out of the parking lot, I knew I had to find help. I couldn't just run. I had to expose them, to make sure they could never hurt anyone again. But as I drove away from St. Mary's Hospital, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still in their grasp, that the darkness they embodied would follow me wherever I went. I drove away from St. Mary's, my heart still racing and the adrenaline coursing through my veins. The road ahead blurred into a haze of fear and uncertainty. I couldn't stop thinking about the sinister laughter of the nurses, the twisted rituals they had been conducting in the shadows. I knew I had to do something, but what? As I made my way to my apartment, I fought against the rising panic. I needed to gather my thoughts and figure out a plan. Maybe I could contact the authorities, but would they believe me? What if they dismissed my claims as the ramblings of an overworked nurse? When I finally arrived home, I locked the door behind me, my heart still pounding. I stumbled into my living room, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. I glanced out the window, half expecting to see Laura, Jenna, and Mark lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to slip up. But the street was empty, and for a brief moment, I felt a flicker of relief. I grabbed my phone and started researching local news reports, hoping to find something, anything, that could connect my new colleagues to the incidents at the hospital. My fingers flew across the screen as I searched for articles on unusual patient deaths, unexplained disappearances, or strange occurrences in St. Mary's history. Hours passed as I dug deeper into the abyss, but I found nothing concrete. It was as if they had covered their tracks perfectly. Just when I felt like I was on the brink of a breakthrough, I heard a soft knock at my door, sending chills down my spine. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Was it them? Had they followed me? I tiptoed to the peephole, my heart racing, and peeked through. To my shock, it was Sarah, the older nurse I had spoken with earlier. She looked anxious, her eyes darting nervously as she glanced down the hallway. I opened the door just a crack. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" Her voice trembled slightly as she whispered, "Let me in, Anna. We don't have much time." I hesitated but opened the door wider, letting her inside. "What's going on? Are you okay?" She glanced around as if expecting someone to appear from the shadows. "I've been watching you. You're right about Laura, Jenna, and Mark. They're not just nurses. They're part of something much darker. I should have warned you earlier, but I didn't realize how serious it was until it was too late." I felt my stomach drop. "What do you mean? What are they doing?" Sarah took a deep breath, her face pale. "They're collecting souls, Anna. It sounds insane, but they believe they can trap the essence of their patients. They think they can harness their power somehow. The deaths, they're not accidents. They're sacrifices." I stepped back, trying to process her words. "Why didn't you report them?" "Because I was afraid," she admitted, her voice shaking. "They have influence, and anyone who speaks out, well, they disappear. I've seen it happen. I thought I could stay under the radar, but now they know you're onto them. You have to be careful." I felt a surge of anger mixed with fear. "But we can't just let them continue this. We have to do something." Sarah nodded, determination flickering in her eyes. "We need evidence, something that can expose them for what they truly are. If we can get into the records room at the hospital, we can find the proof we need." The idea terrified me, but deep down, I knew it was the only way. "When do we do this?" I asked, my voice steadying. "Tonight," Sarah replied, her expression serious. "We can't waste any more time. They're becoming bolder, and I fear they may already be planning something bigger. We need to get in and out before they realize we're onto them." As the night deepened, I felt a mix of fear and resolve. I couldn't let the darkness consume St. Mary's, and I wouldn't allow Laura, Jenna, and Mark to prey on the vulnerable patients who depended on us. We gathered supplies, a flashlight, a few pens, and a small notepad to jot down anything we found. We arrived at the hospital around midnight. the building looming before us like a malevolent giant. As we slipped through a side entrance, I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing against me, a suffocating reminder of the evil that lurked within. Moving cautiously through the dimly lit hallways, we made our way to the records room, adrenaline pumping through my veins. Every creak of the floorboards made me jump, every shadow felt like it could come to life at any moment. But we pressed on, fueled by the need to uncover the truth. When we reached the records room, I quickly glanced around, ensuring the coast was clear. Sarah fished out a key card from her pocket and swiped it, the door unlocking with a soft click. I held my breath as we slipped inside. The room was cramped and cluttered, filled with towering shelves of files and dusty old cabinets. I felt a sense of urgency wash over me as we began searching for any documents that could link the new nurses to the mysterious deaths. As we rifled through the files, I stumbled upon a folder marked Patient Disposition, my heart racing as I opened it. Inside were reports of patients who had died under questionable circumstances, alongside the names of the nurses who had cared for them. "Look at this," I said, showing Sarah the page. They were all treated by Laura, Jenna, and Mark. Just then, a chilling voice echoed from the doorway. "What are you two doing here?" I turned to see Laura standing there, her expression twisted in anger. Jenna and Mark flanked her, their eyes gleaming with malice. "Did you really think you could uncover our secret without consequences?" Panic surged through me as I realized we were trapped. Sarah grabbed my arm, her face pale. "Run!" she shouted, but before we could make a move, they lunged at us. In that moment, everything felt like it was happening in slow motion. I could see the darkness closing in, the laughter echoing in my ears, and the sickening realization that I had walked straight into their trap. The fight for our lives had only just begun.